The world believed Princess Diana's fortune would vanish into the royal vault after her death. They were wrong. When executors unsealed her will in 1997, they discovered something the palace never anticipated.
You think you know Princess Diana, the wedding dress, the landmines, the handshake with an AIDS patient that changed how the world saw illness and fear. But almost nobody knows what actually happened to her money, her jewelry, and her legacy after she died. And the real story is stranger, sadder, and far more human than any rumor could be. Today we're going through Princess Diana's actual will, what it said, who it really named, and why one man ended up holding more power over her memory than anyone expected. Before she was the people's princess, Diana Frances Spencer was a shy, aristocratic teenager from Norfolk, raised at Park House and later Althorpe, the Spencer family estate. Her childhood was shaped by her parents' bitter divorce, something she rarely spoke about publicly, but which friends later said left her guarded and anxious to be needed. She wasn't a debutante trying to catch a prince. At 19, she was working as an assistant at a London kindergarten, living a fairly ordinary life for some of her background, when her path crossed with Prince Charles. Their engagement was announced in early 1981, and the wedding that July at St. Paul's Cathedral was watched by an enormous global television audience, often cited as one of the largest in history. She arrived in an ivory silk gown with a dramatic 25-foot train, and for a moment, the fairy tale looked complete. A shy former nursery assistant had become the Princess of Wales. The reality inside the marriage was far more complicated. Charles's prior relationship with Camilla Parker Bowles never fully ended, and Diana came to feel its presence almost immediately. She later spoke candidly about struggling with bulimia during this period, describing it as something that grew out of the stress and isolation of adjusting to royal life under constant scrutiny. The palace, built around composure and restraint, had little space for a young woman who felt and showed so much. By the early 1990s, the marriage had publicly unraveled. A leaked recording of a private phone call between Charles and Camilla, what tabloids nicknamed Camillagate, became a global embarrassment in 1992, the same year Charles and Diana formally separated. Then, in 1995, Diana did something no modern royal had done before. She sat for a televised interview with the BBC's Martin Bashir on the program Panorama and spoke openly about her marriage, her mental health, and her place in the royal family. It was a turning point. The dutiful bride had become someone willing to use the media on her own terms, not the palace's. What followed, the separation and eventual 1996 divorce, wasn't retreat. It was arguably the most consequential period of Diana's public life. Freed from many of the constraints of formal royal duty, she leaned harder into causes that the institution around her had often treated as too political or too uncomfortable. Her 1987 visit to an AIDS ward at Middlesex Hospital in London is still remembered as a landmark moment. At a time when public fear and misinformation about HIV and AIDS were widespread and patients were frequently isolated or stigmatized, Diana was photographed shaking hands with a patient without wearing gloves. It was a small physical gesture that carried enormous symbolic weight, and it's widely credited with helping shift public attitudes about how people living with HIV should be treated. A decade later, in January 1997, she traveled to Angola to draw attention to humanitarian crisis caused by landmines left over from the country's civil war. Photographs of her walking through a cleared minefield, wearing body armor and a visor for safety but no traditional royal protocol, became some of the most widely circulated images of her life. Her advocacy is credited with helping build political momentum for the Ottawa Treaty, formerly the Convention on the Prohibition of the Use, Stockpiling, Production, and Transfer of Anti-Personnel Mines, which was signed later that same year and has since been ratified by well over 100 countries. The international campaign to ban landmines, a coalition of organizations she'd helped bring global attention to, received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1997. She also supported causes involving leprosy patients, homelessness charities, and children's hospitals, often visiting without the fanfare of formal royal tour. Reports from the period suggest Charles and some of the royal household privately viewed aspects of her high-profile charity work as attention-seeking or difficult to manage alongside the institution's more reserved traditions. Whether or not that framing was fair, Diana's approach, physical closeness visible emotion, direct engagement with people the establishment often kept at arm's length, was a genuine departure from how the monarchy had operated for generations. By the time her divorce was finalized in 1996, Diana was no longer defined by her marriage. She had built an independent identity as one of the most recognizable humanitarian figures in the world. And that identity is what she carried into the final and least understood chapter of her story. The writing and eventual reading of her will hears with a popular imagination, and the actual legal record diverged sharply. Diana's was not some late-night, tearful, secret document drafted in the final months of her life, as dramatic retellings sometimes suggest. According to royal historians who have examined the document, she signed it in 1993, around the time of her separation from Charles, using an inheritance of roughly £5 million she received the previous year after her father's death as the basis for its terms. She never rewrote it after her 1996 divorce settlement, which added a further £16 million or so to her estate. In other words, the will that governed the distribution of her final estate was, in some ways, already 3 or 4 years old by the time she died in August 1997. That a very different picture from the idea of Diana crafting an elaborate, secret master plan in her final days. Some royal commentators have actually described the will as fairly standard and not particularly elaborate for someone of her wealth and profile. When the High Court Justice in England assessed her estate after her death, it was valued at roughly £21.7 million, around $30 to $35 million at the time, depending on the exchange rate used. After inheritance tax, which took more than £8 million, the net estate distributed to beneficiaries was closer to £13 million. So who actually inherited it? The executors and trustees of the will, the people legally responsible for managing and distributing the estate, were not a mystery butler or a secret confidant. They were Diana's mother, Frances Shan Kidd, and her older sister, Sarah McCorquodale. This detail alone corrects one of the most persistent myths about Diana's estate. Her butler, Paul Burrell, was never made executor of her will. He was a beneficiary, not the person in charge of distributing her fortune. The bulk of the estate, the vast majority of the money, was placed into a residuary trust intended for her 2 sons, William and Harry, to be divided between them once they reached a specified age. Her original will stated they should receive their full inheritance at 25. A separate letter attached to the will, sometimes called a letter of wishes, asked that a quarter of her personal property, referred to legally as chattels, be divided among her 17 godchildren, and Paul Burrell, her devoted butler of roughly a decade, was left £50,000, a meaningful sum and a clear sign of how much she trusted and valued him, but fixed bequest, not control over her fortune or her legacy. If the popular story about Diana's will gets one thing most wrong, it's this. The real drama after her death wasn't about a butler seizing secret control. It was about her own family quietly overriding some of her explicit wishes. Shortly after Diana's death, her executors, her mother and sister, went to probate court seeking what's known as a variation of the will. The result, sometimes referred to as the arrangement, delayed William and Harry's full inheritance from age 25 to age 30, though they were permitted to draw interest from the trust starting at 25. It's a significant, largely underreported detail. The people managing Diana's estate legally altered the timeline of her own instructions for her sons. Even more striking is what happened with the godchildren's inheritance. Diana's letter of wishes had asked that a quarter of her personal property be split among her 17 godchildren. But because that letter was a separate, non-binding wish rather than a formally executed part of the will itself, her executors were not legally required to follow it, and, according to royal historians, largely did not. Instead of receiving a meaningful share of her personal effects, most godchildren reportedly received single items each, things like decorative figurines or pieces of crockery, described by more than one commentator as disappointing given what had originally been promised. There's also the matter of how private this all was, or rather, how public it unexpectedly became. Royal wills are typically sealed by the courts and kept confidential. But because Diana was no longer formally a working member of the royal family at the time of her death, her will did not receive that automatic protection, and its content became a matter of public record that people could, and did, go and purchase copies of. So the real story isn't a hidden butler-controlled empire. It's something quieter and in some ways more uncomfortable. A mother and sister making legal changes to a dead woman's stated wishes, and 17 godchildren left with mementos instead of the inheritance they'd been promised. None of this means Paul Burrell was irrelevant to how Diana's story unfolded after her death. Far from it. He simply wielded his influence differently than popular myth suggests. Not through legal control of her estate, but through his personal possession of her letters, his closeness to her sons in the years after her death, and eventually his own choice to speak and write publicly about their relationship. In 2001, Burrell was arrested and charged with theft, accused of taking a large number of items belonging to Diana's estate, reportedly including clothing, letters, and personal keepsakes, without authorization. The case went to trial in 2002 and became a significant public spectacle, offering an unusually intimate look at Diana's private world and Burrell's role within it. The trial collapsed partway through, after it emerged that Burrell had, at an earlier point, told the Queen about having taken possession of certain items for safekeeping, a detail that undercut the theft case against him. Prosecutors ultimately abandoned the charges, and no verdict of guilt was ever recorded against him. Following the collapse of the trial, Burrell went on to publish a memoir, A Royal Duty, in 2003, which detailed his years working for Charles and Diana, and included personal reflections on her life, her state of mind, and her private relationships. The book's publication reportedly strained his relationship with the royal family further, with William and Harry issuing a joint statement describing it as a betrayal of their mother's confidence. He later published additional books drawing on his time with Diana. Years later, in 2007 and 2008, Burrell also testified at the formal inquest into Diana's death, addressing questions about her personal life, including her relationship with cardiac surgeon Hasnat Khan, and a letter Diana had reportedly written him expressing fears about her safety. The coroner overseeing the inquest, Lord Justice Scott Baker, ultimately concluded that Diana's death was a result of the grossly negligent driving of her driver, Henri Paul, combined with the actions of pursuing photographers, rather than any conspiracy, though the process gave renewed public attention to Burrell's private knowledge of Diana's final years. None of this made Burrell the executor of her estate or the person with legal authority over her fortune. But it does explain why so many later retellings, including, likely, the very story that inspired the question you might have heard elsewhere, collapse the man who knew her best into the man who controlled everything she left behind. Those are two very different things, and conflating them is where a lot of more sensational Diana content on the internet goes wrong. Strip away the myth of a secret master plan, and what's left is something arguably more impressive. A body of humanitarian work that kept generating real-world impact for decades after Diana's death, without needing any hidden trust or covert scheme to explain it. The Diana, Princess of Wales Memorial Fund, established shortly after her death, channeled substantial charitable donations toward causes she had championed, including HIV and AIDS support, landmine clearance, and services for vulnerable children. Her advocacy is frequently cited by historians of the landmine ban movement as one of the key public pressures that helped push the Ottawa Treaty toward broad international adoption. Her early, highly visible support for people living with HIV is widely credited with helping normalize public attitudes at a moment when stigma was arguably one of the biggest obstacles to effective public health responses. Her family home, Althorpe, was open to the public in the years after her death, and includes an exhibition dedicated to her life, drawing a steady stream of visitors annually and helping preserve public memory of her work, separate from tabloid narratives about her private life. William and Harry, meanwhile, eventually did receive their full inheritances once they reached the revised age threshold, along with certain personal items of deep sentimental value. Most famously, Diana's sapphire and diamond engagement ring, which William later gave to Kate Middleton when he proposed, linking his mother's story directly to his own in a way no amount of money could have arranged. The emotional toll on her sons, meanwhile, was real and has been discussed by both of them in different ways over the years. Harry has spoken candidly, including in his memoir, about how growing up under the shadow of his mother's fame and death shaped his eventual decision to step back from royal duties. William has more often channeled his grief into public initiatives, including charitable awards created in his mother's name, generally maintaining a more private posture about the emotional weight of the inheritance itself. It's worth asking, honestly, Why stories about secret trusts and butler-controlled empires keep resurfacing online, sometimes gaining more traction than the real, documented history. Part of it is simply that Diana's actual estate story, while significant, is fundamentally a story about probate law, trust variations, and family disputes over the timing of an inheritance, important but not naturally cinematic. A tale involving a secret account funding modern royal rebellions offers a tidier, more dramatic narrative arc, even if it isn't supported by any court record, legal filing, or credible historical account. Part of it is also that Paul Burrell's genuinely unusual